Have you ever wondered why God didn't become incarnate as Jesus today, with all the benefits of global communications in order to get the gospel out? Why did Jesus come 2,000 years ago, and are the critics right when they charge Jesus' 1st century AD setting as a foolish choice if God's purpose was to persuade the world to believe? If you've ever asked any of those questions, then check this out. Well, the 1st century AD might seem a relatively arbitrary point to us in the grand sweep of history, and whilst we might wish to scrutinize Jesus' teaching and miracles personally today, the New Testament speaks of God's sovereign hand purposefully guiding the whole arc of history, sending Jesus at just the right time. In Mark 1:15, for instance, Jesus opens his messianic preaching with the words, "The time is fulfilled." The Apostle Paul in Galatians 4:4 speaks of God in the fullness of time sending forth his Son. And John's Gospel constantly speaks of Jesus working to a careful timeline, awaiting his hour to come, with Paul again in Romans 5:6 saying that at just the right time, Christ died for us. Now these verses are only a taster of the way Scripture speaks of God's wisdom, dictating when and how he sends Jesus, sovereignly choosing the time of the incarnation and atonement to bring about his ultimate endgame. So what makes this 1st century AD setting the right time for Jesus to come? Well, let me give you 3 reasons. First, Jesus' coming makes our world possible. Now, counterfactuals are tricky business for us finite creatures. When we say we wish Jesus came today, rather than 2,000 years ago, what we ignore is how Jesus' absence from the 1st century AD would radically alter civilizational timelines. Now, we might think the world would develop along a similar track, but anyone familiar with the fragility of human empires on the one hand, or with chaos theory on the other, recognizes the slightest change to the beliefs and events of the past could have incalculable effects on the moral and technological arc of the future. So try to imagine then erasing Jesus from the past, the one figure Time magazine dubbed as the most influential to have ever lived. Simply put, our world today would be utterly unimaginable without Jesus. Scholars of various stripes, from the agnostic historian Tom Holland to the Indian philosopher Vishal Mangalwadi, they give scores of examples of the ways that the life and legacy of Jesus of Nazareth and the Christian story have changed our world for good. From the rise of modern science to the abolition of the Western slave trade, from the limiting of the powers of kings and the articulation of universal human rights, for the concern from the poor right up to the rise of hospitals and healthcare for all, there are scores of credible academic sources that trace the cultural riches of our civilization back to the colossal figure of Jesus. So perhaps one of the reasons why, in God's providence, he sent Jesus into the 1st century AD is to ensure that this future comes about. You could say by sending Jesus at just the right time, God predestined you to exist with all the advantages of this age that make you pose that question in the first place. That's cool, right? Second, God's timing maximizes the gospel spread. When you look at the unique geopolitical situation of Judea in the 1st century AD, various factors converge to make it poised for the Great Commission. Take language. 3 centuries before Jesus, Alexander the Great expanded his empire right around the known world, spreading the influence of Greek language and literature. That means by the time of Jesus then, in the 1st century AD, rather than facing the problem posed by Babel, where no one could understand a common message, you had a thoroughly Hellenized world that all spoke Greek as the lingua franca, or common trade tongue, enabling this gospel to be easily spread. Or take the Pax Romana and Roman roads. With the Roman legions securing peace by the sword, especially for Roman citizens, and ensuring safer travel through trade by connecting the major cities, all of a sudden, Jesus' apostles, especially Paul, had this unique freedom that enabled them to cover vast distances relatively unhindered to take the gospel to the nations. Or take the synagogue system brought about by the Jewish diaspora, where after Assyria defeated the northern kingdom of Israel right back in 723 BC, communities of God's people were spread around the Assyrian Empire. That meant that by the 1st century AD, in most of the major cities around the now Roman Empire to which the apostles traveled, there were already these rich Jewish communities, devoted to Torah and awaiting a coming Messiah, making them fertile soil for gospel preaching and a staging ground from which to plant new churches, often with ready-made elders who loved God, knew the scriptures, and were committed to a Judeo-Christian vision of ethics in an otherwise pagan world. So, given the tumultuous circumstances of these ancient empires before and after Jesus' coming, The 1st century AD provided the right confluence of social and political factors to enable the rapid spread of the gospel message throughout this ancient world, making it the right time for Jesus to come. And third, Jesus fulfills the prophetic timeline. One of the concerns of critics is that Jesus' coming in the 1st century AD mires the evidential value of the apostles' testimony, as pre-scientific ignorance and mythical thinking supposedly predisposed them to falsely believe in miracle claims, like in the resurrection story. Now, not only is this an instance of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, with the apostolic sources of the New Testament actually being careful to challenge faulty miracle claims and offer credible testimony, but in fact, the timing of Jesus' coming actually offers more evidence in the case for Christianity. How? Well, through fulfillment of a prophetic timeline for the Messiah's arrival. Now, I get that the argument from fulfilled prophecy has been poorly made often at a popular level. That's why I've written on the subject, fortifying a humble version of this argument for critics to consider, and we've created some videos on this channel which we'll link in the description. But for those who are new to this subject, the Jewish Bible, or the Christian Old Testament, it includes a constellation of historical events that surround the coming of a divine and messianic king, offering a prophetic timeline Jesus had to fulfill. Genesis 49:10 speaks of the scepter, or the right to self-rule, not being removed from Judah until God comes, a prophecy that became tied up with messianic expectations. Rome removed the Jewish right to capital punishment in 6 AD. Malachi 3:1 was also tied to messianic expectations, where this divine figure is prophesied to come quickly to his temple, a temple destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. And the 70-week prophecy in Daniel 9:24-27 speaks of 483 lunar years from the period between Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 445 BC and the coming of Messiah, foretelling the Messiah would then be cut off or killed, and sometime afterwards Jerusalem would be destroyed. So how does this prophetic timeline fit the story of Jesus in the Gospels? Well, perfectly. Jesus coming in the 1st century, it threads all of these prophetic needles. So not only should we thank Jesus for his towering influence that led to this world we now inhabit and enjoy, and recognize God's wisdom in sending forth his Son at the right time for the gospel to go out, but we should chew on the prophetic evidence God has embedded into history, with Jesus' coming in the 1st century AD adding fulfilled prophecy to the list of some 24 or so arguments in the cumulative case for Christianity. Jesus may as well adapt Gandalf's famous line from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings: "A Messiah is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." Hey, I hope you found that helpful. My name's Dan Patterson, and here at Questioning Christianity, we have hundreds of videos helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions, exploring theology, history, philosophy, and apologetics. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? And if you jump over to our social accounts on Instagram and Facebook, we translate all of these videos into infographics for you to share away. If you want to help us reach more people, then our Patreon details are linked in the description, or you can find out how to donate at questioningchristianity.com. Thanks for your support, and as always, truth invites questioning.